Thank you for coming here, guys. So we are going to have, Matt Lewis from IBM. We are going to hear from, AWS, GenAI, Amazon Q, hottest stuff on clouds right now. I'm really excited to see your talk. Thanks for coming.
Cheers, thank you. So welcome everyone, and hope you all had a great lunch. My name's Matt Lewis. I'm privileged to be one of the AWS heroes. Currently work as AWS Chief Architect at IBM in UK and Ireland. And a lot of my work over the last 12 months has been around using new sort of GenAI capabilities to test new features, look at different service integrations, look at how we can sort of accelerate delivery onto AWS Cloud. So hopefully I'll be able to share some of that sort of information today with you in terms of that you can take home and look at ways that you can improve developer productivity in your own organization. So we start off with a couple of quotes that have come out of research organizations in the last sort of 6 to 12 months. And the first is basically talking about a general lack of software engineers within the industry as a whole. And that has an implication, and the implication is that engineers are being sort of stretched. So when you join an organization, you may find that you have to support multiple applications. There may be unfamiliar code bases. You may be unfamiliar programming languages. And the thing with the industry today is that also there's a competitive advantage. So organizations are always looking to try and implement new functionality. So it becomes very difficult in terms of, you're landed there in a role trying to support an unfamiliar application. How can you then deliver new functionality on top of that? And the second one is more about this sort of call to arms. So research that have come out of Gartner at an enterprise level found that the adoption in the enterprise of AI coding assistants is expected to increase from 10% last year up to 75% and beyond. So this is really a case that if you're not using AI coding assistants in your organization today, you can bet that your competitors are. And that's going to give them an advantage in terms of delivering new functionality and getting value add in front of their customers. So if there's one thing that you take away from this talk, I'm really hoping if there's any time to start trying to try out some of this capability, it's today. And within AWS, when we talk about coding assistants, we're predominantly talking about Amazon Q Developer. So you may be thinking in terms of why Q and what sets it apart from other coding assistants. So the first thing for me is around provenance of data. So I think some of the things we've touched on already today have been sort of looking at, the quality of code suggestions that you get from a coding assistant is going to be related to the quality of the training data that it's been trained on. So these underlying foundation models basically ingest a huge body of knowledge, a corpus of knowledge. And in the case of Amazon Q, we're talking about billions of lines of internal source code from AWS, as well as open source code. So that means that if you're looking to build an application on top of AWS, and you're looking for best practices in terms of how do you have a Lambda function talk to a DynamoDB table, or any of these sort of native AWS service integrations, then you're going to get better code suggestions coming out of Amazon Q because it's been trained on the internal AWS documentation. I think we also heard Massimo this morning talking about things like trust. And you hear a lot about trust and ethics and so on within AI today. And one of the things, as well as the provenance of training data from an AWS angle, is the fact that the pro tier of Amazon Q Developer comes with IP indemnification. So that means that it provides a level of guarantee against it in terms of the code that it suggests as part of its outputs. And so much work has gone on with Amazon Q over the last couple of months. So this is something that got published, I think it was probably only about 2 or 3 days ago. So it's you can go to swe-bench.com and look at their leaderboard. So this is like a benchmark in terms of coding assistance. And the way that it works is it is based on thousands of open GitHub issues, and it challenges these tools to resolve those issues, and then it runs unit tests against to verify to see, has it actually delivered code that runs and meets and passes all of these unit tests. So as of Wednesday last week, when you look at the leaderboard, Amazon Q Developer is now the top ranked as part of that coding capability, which is a great story. And I just wanted to sort of quickly touch on sort of like the sort of suite of AI ML services that are available on AWS. So this is, when you're looking at how can I generate code, or how can I pass in some code and understand it in terms of English to code, code to English, people heard about things like Amazon Q Developer, you'd have heard about Bedrock, heard about things like SageMaker. So for me, it's all about this complexity. It's a line or curve of complexity. So if you're looking to do something from a coding assistant perspective, Amazon Q Developer offers the simplest way to get started. So you can get started as an extension in your IDE. It has a very high level of abstraction. That means all of these options that you have in terms of, what foundation model to use, how do I tune it, that gets taken away from you to allow you to get started on day one. Now, as you move down this sort of curve, there are additional services. So you look at things like Bedrock, and Bedrock then gives you this choice of different foundation models. It gives you things like, auto, fine training and tuning and other sort of hyperparameters that you can use. But again, that adds a little bit more complexity and a little more options that you have to take yourself as an engineer. And then it goes all the way down to things like SageMaker, which is brilliant when you're in the machine learning, data science world. And there's all of these sort of things that you can do, like quantization. You can do things like model pruning. You can take things like Trainium and Inferentia, and you can use spot instances, and you can really drive down the cost. But it requires a huge amount of skill. So this is where I sort of drive things down. If you're trying to get started in a coding assistant, I drive things down to quite a simple sort of decision tree. So if you're looking to get started, if you're looking to use one of the popular programming languages that are available today, Q is very likely to be, your starting position. So if it turns out that actually one of the tasks you have, and I think going back to the keynote this morning, a lot of the things was all around, context. So if you're doing some work today, and one of the things that you're looking to do is, migrate an application off things like COBOL running on a mainframe into, whether it's Python, JavaScript, Java, whatever it may be, you'll find that things like COBOL won't be particularly well supported on Q. So if you're starting to look at some of those programming languages, that's when you'd look at things like Bedrock, and you can look at things like Llama 3 and Code Llama and tune those models, and you'll get better results. There's also this concept around where people talk about mega prompts. So in terms of the data that you want to pass into a foundation model. So there are now foundation models that support hundreds of thousands and even millions of tokens that you can pass in. If you have a requirement that needs that sort of mega prompt, then you're going to have to start looking at Bedrock. But again, from my perspective, those are more sort of edge cases, and I kind of reckon that, in sort of 80, 90% plus, even more of that, the starting position for everyone today is going to be Amazon Q Developer. So now we get into like the core of the presentation, which is going to be a fairly whistle-stop tour. So the intention here is to try and hopefully show you at least one or two examples that make you think, oh, I didn't know that it could do that. And so we're going to cover a number of topics in terms of how you can help improve developer productivity, looking at areas like creating code. How do you know that code that you've created is going to be secure? How can you understand an application that you've just inherited, modernize an application, and even do things like implement a new feature? So we start off creating code. And if we think about the keynote this morning, there was this talk about, I think it was like the roadmap of coding assistants and where to start from. And the start, which people are all used to today, is this sort of code completion. So it's sort of like IntelliSense and those types of things in your code editor. So effectively, you can start typing some lines of code, your code editor sends it off, it understands what it is that you're trying to do, and then it will come up with a suggestion that you can accept. So you drive that by writing the code. So in this case, when I start typing, it knows that I'm starting to type the handler function for a Lambda, and it comes back and comes up with a suggestion that I can accept. We move on from that to then look at things like code generation. So with code generation is when you start creating a natural language instruction. And that natural language instruction needs to be sort of short, specific, concise, and that sets out the requirements, which effectively form part of the input context, along with things like open files and the surrounding code blocks. So you can provide a natural language requirement, and then Q will come back and it will come up with a suggestion for what it thinks, how you can support that requirement. And you get into things like, chain of thought prompting here, because, essentially what works best is short, concise specific prompts that you want to give it to come up, as opposed to trying to ask it to build an entire whole application. And the other thing that's really good about Q here is that it's not just programming languages that it supports. In terms of creating code, it supports infrastructure as code frameworks. So you can do the same thing in terms of creating CloudFormation templates, Terraform, CDK, and it also supports SQL as well. So you can have a file where you're asking it to create a table, or even go create inner joins, unions, and it will generate the ANSI SQL compatible code that you can then use and run. The next thing I want to touch on, customizations. So I don't know if people are familiar with customizations, but at the beginning of the talk, we started saying how foundation models are trained on this base corpus of knowledge, this base data. The problem for some of these organizations is that you'll have custom applications and you have your own internal coding styles. So you might have a custom application and you want any developer that interacts with that to call it in a specific way. You may have standards around logging, error handling, these types of things. So customizations now within Q, it's in preview. That essentially allows you to train a profile against your own code base. So you can hook that up to a Git repository. So whether that's code commit or GitHub or GitLab, or you can even move code or copy code across into an S3 bucket and then train a profile on there. And then when you're in your IDE, you can select customization. So if you're then trying to write code that's going to be against one of your internal applications, you can select that specific customization, and then the code suggestions that will come back from Q will comply with your own internal code standards and patterns and best practices. And finally, another one to touch on is actually Q on the command line. So again, this is another thing that takes natural language prompts and converts them into executable shell snippets. And the thing with this is, for me, it's all about the developer flow and keeping people within the IDE. So there's lots of occasions where you may be writing some code and, for example, it's say, oh, I've made a mistake with that git commit, now I need to try and reverse that last git commit. Or what's the command again? And the thing is, what you don't want to do is you don't want the developer to have to understand or try and remember hundreds of different CLI commands from hundreds of different CLIs. So instead of having to then open a browser window, get distracted, move out to the code editor, what this allows you to do is, within the terminal, within the code editor, is open up Q for the command line and basically enter a natural language instruction. And from that, you can even go and actually execute that shell script directly or edit it and then execute it. So it's a really, really powerful tool that's available in the code editor. And then from there, we move on to, you've now generated some code. How do you know that it's secure and doesn't have vulnerabilities associated with it? So Q comes with the capability that will automatically scan your code for vulnerabilities, code quality issues, and generate these findings. And it's powered by a detector library. So this is a detector library that's part of Code Guru. These have been trained in terms of years of best practices from AWS and from Amazon.com. And it won't only detect vulnerabilities that are present within things like your source code, it will also detect vulnerabilities within infrastructure as code, so things like CloudFormation and Terraform. So we'll just take a quick look in terms of showing how that happens. So this is actually a sample file. You might not be able to see it too well, but this is basically just some code that's taken from a sample library from detector library to demonstrate this has a known vulnerability. And you'll see that it's been automatically detected. You can pause auto scans, you can trigger running a scan. But what you can sort of do is, as we come along, is we can highlight the code, and in here we can say, oh, detect this vulnerability, view more details on it. So this then you can link to the CWE library, find out more information. But you can also click this button called Explain. And when you click Explain, that then sends that information into a prompt in Q, into the chat window, that now will tell you more information about that vulnerability. And you can start then having a conversation and asking more questions about it. So it's a really, really powerful concept. And the other thing then what we're going to show is just showing something very quickly within CloudFormation. So we're going to add a CloudFormation snippet doesn't follow the AWS best practice because point-in-time recovery isn't enabled on the DynamoDB table. So this is all done in real time here. So what we'll see is that the vulnerability scanning detects it in near real time. We go across and view the details, but here's like a button at the top saying fix. So we click that button, that automatically remediates that issue within the CloudFormation template. So again, that's something just showing how you can connect up vulnerability scanning with QChat in your code editor as you're sort of writing code, as you're updating code. So again, a really, really powerful feature. And then next up is code understanding. So this is a sample file that's taken as part of creating documentation for crates in the Rust programming language. So, the Rust programming language is a language I don't know. And this may be like, typical for many people who come along, and all of a sudden you inherited a code base. And, I know Massimo this morning talked about people often think about things being English code. But a really common use case now is about taking code and trying to get some English from it in terms of how does this actually work. So what we do here, I'm trying to understand more about a particular function, or it could be a method, a snippet of code. So we select that, we right-click, we say send to Amazon Q, and then we choose the top option saying explain. And what this is basically saying is, can you explain this snippet of code to me? How does this code work? This then goes away, it evaluates that code, and it comes back and tells you more about it. And then because the Amazon Q chat window is conversational, what that then allows you to do is ask more questions about it. So the next one I'm going to touch on is application visualization. So I don't know if many people in the room have heard of Application Composer. So it's it's a service that came out a number of years ago, but it's something that's been significantly improved over the last 12 months. So Application Composer now supports over 1,000 CloudFormation resources. And something else that's also happened is there's something called IAC CloudFormation Generator, code generator. So one of the things you do now, historically people may take over an application that hasn't followed best practice. So it hasn't been built, hasn't been built up in an automated way. There isn't a CloudFormation template that allows you to deploy it, do things like drift detection. But what you can do now is you can take running resources in your account, and you can automatically generate the CloudFormation template from that. So what we're going to do now is sort of show how you may, you can look through the code, and we're showing how you can do things like code to English and get some explanations from it. But now we want to sort of visualize it and see how do these sort of resources connect with each other? How are the dependencies? So this is basically just taking a sample library from GitHub. It's a library that looks really cool. It talks about things like Bedrock and LangChain, and it's got Kendra and Lex and other things in. So in here, all we're basically doing is we're going to clone that repository. We go back into our IDE. We clone that repository, and that repository also includes the CloudFormation template for it. So what we can do, we can take the CloudFormation template, right-click on, and we say, open with Application Composer. This now builds up brings up a visual editor. So that allows you now to show all of the dependencies between the different CloudFormation resources that you have in your template. You can click into individual ones, you can see more details about it. And the thing that's really nice about Application Composer is that it's bidirectional. So this will actually synchronize from the visual editor to CloudFormation. And if you make a change to if you make a change directly to the CloudFormation template, it will synchronize back, and you'll be able to see that. It also allows you to do things like, you could start with an empty CloudFormation template. You could drag across API Gateway, Lambda, Dynamo. You can link them together, and it will actually generate those integrations for you following AWS best practice in your CloudFormation template. So again, a really powerful tool if you want to start visualizing your application. Now look at code modernization. So again, you pick up an application, you've been told it's not performing. So again, with Q now, you can select something. So select a snippet of code, send to Q, and you can say things like optimize. So in this case, this will go away and sort of say, well, there's actually a way that you can now optimize that code to break, or to consolidate the two loops into a single loop. It also allows you to ask more questions if you want to about it. So we can sort of go up, and one of the things that you can do, which is quite nice, is within these sort of code snippets in Q, you can just insert that code snippet directly in. So another thing we're then going to show now is you can also generate code directly by asking questions in the Q chat window. So now we're asking to create a JavaScript function that implements a bubble sort algorithm, and we'll then insert that into our code editor. This is just sort of saying, like, so now we've got some existing code. It's a function, it implements bubble sort algorithm. We may not know what that is. But the thing that's nice about this now is they're saying, what happens if we're moving away from JavaScript? What happens if we're now a Python shop? You can now select that, send it to Q, and you can say, well, convert this function to Python. And now what Q will now do is it will carry out a code conversion for you, a code translation, taking the JavaScript function and converting that into the equivalent function in Python. So again, some really powerful techniques that you can do, that you can get out of the box with Q, that allow you to do things like optimizations, allow you to do things like code translations. And we're going to finish on two things. So I think the thing that struck me from Massimo's keynote this morning was when we looked at what is the future of coding assistants and where we're moving to, and I think he described something called agents, and he described them as sophisticated workflows that carry out specific tasks. So there are two agents that are available in Q today. So there's an agent for feature development or software development, and there's an agent for code transformation. So look at the one for software development. So this basically allows you now to implement some new functionality within an existing project. So what I'm going to do here is, and it's an example of how you can do this from scratch yourself, is you basically just go and initialize a new project using serverless application models. We use a quick start template, generate a repository using the serverless API. That now creates this content for us that has API Gateway, Lambda, Dynamo. It has a bunch of different APIs that are already there. And what we're then able to do here is we kind of say, well, we actually want to go and generate a new API, but we want to follow all the coding standards. So we do a /dev that brings up this developer agent. And here I'm saying, create a new REST API that allows you to, whatever it might be, return an item by name, but effectively create a new API. And what you'll see here is that Q now comes up with a very detailed implementation plan. So on its own, this is really valuable. So it starts going through telling you, these are all the files that you'll need to change. You need to add this type of information into the CloudFormation template. You need to create a new Lambda function. You need to go and create a new event for testing that function locally. This is how you actually test and do a SAM invoke local. These are all the things that you might need. And there's a button, I'm not sure if you saw, there's a button there that we can then click to go away and generate the code. So as well as creating that implementation plan, we now go and generate the code. And the thing that's really nice about it from my perspective is that the code that's generated will follow the same style as the code that already exists in this project. So you can go and click in here, we can see where it's added the new CloudFormation, we can see where it's added the new Lambda function, where it's added the new test event, where it's added the new unit tests, which is added here. And the thing that's nice about that, you can then go and insert the code, so you accept those code changes, but it doesn't say that this is necessarily going to be 100% of exactly how you want it. But once you accept those changes, you can then go in, make some small changes if you need to modify it in some way, and then you can commit that and push that up to the branch. So now, out of the box, Q is now able to sort of implement these new features for you. And then finally, moving on to code transformation. So code transformation at the moment works for Java 8 or Java 11 up to Java 17, and it's .NET is coming soon. So this was a really nice one for me because I was lucky enough to work on a preview of an AWS service called Quantum Ledger Database. So I got a chance about 5 years ago at reInvent to give a talk on QLDB and do some live demos. And one of those was a Java Spring Boot app that was running, I think it was Java 11 at the time. So this was like an application that hadn't been touched for 5 or 6 years. So we decided to try out, well, how does this code transformation agent work? So we can click the transform, and this comes in and detects it and kind of says, oh, I can see you've got a Java 11 module here. Would you like us to upgrade that Java 11 module up to Java 17? So we click accept, and then it goes away, and effectively goes and takes your code, it uploads your code, it checks on all the dependencies, it builds your code in terms of compiles your code against Java 11. Then it will start building this transformation plan. Then when it has the transformation plan, it will start looking to make the changes to any dependencies that you have, and then effectively compile it in Java 17. So you can see all of this information. This is sped up, but this was a relatively, it's a non-trivial example, because you see as it comes up and gives you this sort of, how you transform your project. When it scrolls up, it sort of says, this is something that had 2,500 lines of Java code. It's using a version of Spring Boot that has had new interfaces added to it. That means it breaks compilation. And you'll see that here where you see the red line. It's unable to build a code now in Java 17 because it fails compilation. But what's really nice about this now as part of this sophisticated workflow is it takes that away. It looks up in terms of why is that failed to compile, looks at what those errors in, and then tries to fix those errors, and then it tries to recompile again. And it keeps doing that until it's successfully compiled that into Java 17. So in here now, I can go and view, download the code. I can now go and view these differences. And when I select, so this will pop up a window. So I'll select one of those files now. So when I open the file and scroll down, you see this big area in green, and that's basically saying this is new interface. This has been added effectively by Amazon Q because that interface doesn't exist in the previous version because it didn't exist in the old version of Java Spring Boot. So this was incredibly powerful to me. And the thing that I really liked about it is I used this as a test with code transformation when it first came out a couple of months ago. Didn't like it at all. But then all of a sudden, you can see the massive improvements that have taken place. And I think that's the thing for me. These things in terms of these agents for Amazon Q, they're effectively black box in terms of, you may think that you've tried something, you try it again the next week or the next month, and the sudden improvements that have been made. So this was the first time I've ever run that, and this was run yesterday, showing now that it's, you can take a relatively complex project, breaking changes, and then Q for code transformation has managed to do all of that transformation, including added missing dependencies and so on. So hopefully that has given you all, there's a little bit there that you've learned, and hopefully has encouraged you to want to go and try that out for yourself. So if you want to get in contact, I've got my X handle there and LinkedIn, and I'm going to be around for the rest of the day, so it'd be great to catch up with people. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matt. So we have a couple of minutes. Do you have any questions? No? We can take one if you have any question. Matt, thank you very much for coming all the way. We really appreciate the talk. Great talk. Thank you very much.
Cheers, thank you. Oh. Cheers, thank you so much.